I am a GH5 shooter. I've shot with the GH4. One of my first mirrorless cameras ever was a GH1. I'm very familiar with the GH series, and I'm eagerly anticipating a GH6. Now that we have a Sony a7S Mark III out, or at least announced at this point, we've got the Canon R5. I think the inevitable conclusion that everyone comes to is like, well, what's Panasonic going to do with the next Lumix GH, probably GH6? I have some of my own personal thoughts. We can at least start with an article that I found on Tech Radar. This was written back in June, so it's not, super recent, but this is about the newest article I could find regarding the GH6 and what may be coming. There's not a lot rumored about this camera. I think the pandemic has kind of put things into a little, obviously delayed a lot of things, changed roadmaps and whatnot, and when things get announced and what events are happening. So I don't know that any company necessarily even knows what they're going to do. So it may be futile for me from the outside to even guess or estimate what they're going to do, because they probably don't even know. But we can at least read through some of this article, because I thought it was kind of interesting, a few things they bring up. The first and foremost is that there may be 3 versions of the GH6. So the GH5 came out 3 years ago, and then they followed up with the GH5S for kind of a lower light version of the GH5, which a lot of people have and a lot of people like. It was more expensive, had some trade-offs, but there were 2 versions of the GH5. I personally have only shot with the GH5, the original, not the S version. It didn't seem worth it to me. Now they're talking about maybe there's going to be 3 versions of the GH6, which I actually think they probably shouldn't do. It kind of frustrates me when there's different SKUs of the same camera and the same model. It's like, I get that it's meant to cater to different audiences, but I think you end up confusing a lot of the marketplace when you do that. When you're talking about, oh, there's going to be a GH6, but then there's a GH6V, and then there's also a GH6X, if these are in fact even the names, which they probably aren't. This is probably just a rumor. But if we were to take this at face value and say, okay, is this a good idea for them to implement on their cameras? I would say no. I think having a GH5 as like, this is our flagship GH5, and then they have the G9 and they have the G85 and they have all these GX cameras. There's plenty of SKUs out there. Why does there need to be a slight alteration of the main one? I have the same criticism with the Lumix S1, the full frame camera from Lumix. There's the S1, the S1R, and the S1H, and as a consumer having to figure out and determine, well, which one's right for me. It's nice that the options are there, but the fact that they're so closely aligned, but yet so radically different in important, meaningful ways of like, why is one significantly more expensive? It can be frustrating to have to kind of work through all that. And I think it ends up confusing the messaging. I would say Canon's probably a little bit better about this. They have the Canon R5 and then the R6. Similar cameras, but they have at least a different number, or there's a different enough. It's not like the R5X and the R5V and the R5 A, B, C, and D. At some point, when you add too many, it just becomes ridiculous. And I think even with a few, it can become overwhelming for a lot of people. And they just kind of, well, which one's the good one is ultimately what everyone kind of wants to know. Like, which one should I buy? And in that case, like, maybe you should have just made that one and kind of put all your eggs in that basket. But it's not my company. I'm not the one that gets to say. This article goes on to mention that autofocus should be better. That's obvious. The GH6 desperately needs better autofocus, compared to not necessarily compared to like that the GH5 autofocus is bad, but just that the other options out on the market from Canon and Sony are much better. So improving autofocus is an absolute must. Will it be enough? We'll see. And that's kind of, I'll let you read the rest of the article if you'd like, but it's kind of basic in terms of what's rumored and speculated. So I thought I'd share some of what I think is going to happen, just hypothetically. Let's just have fun. Let's just talk about what a GH6 would look like, and then maybe a little bit of like a wish list from my perspective, what I hope they do. And I've made videos like this in the past about the GH5 before that was out, and they didn't do anything that I wanted. So it's just an exercise for fun. It's not like I actually think these things will come true, but if they do, hey, that'll be awesome. Maybe someone is listening. I think the GH6 will have 6K. It makes sense. The GH4 had 4K. The GH5, not 5K, but like, okay, that's an in-betweener. GH6, let's do 6K. And do they need to go to 8K? I mean, it's been speculated that the sensor may be capable of it, so if it's there, then great. But I think 6K is definitely adequate for most people, and it just kind of makes sense with the name of the camera, the GH6, and it shoots 6K, like a really good, nice, high-quality 6K, like it's a 6K camera. I think that makes sense for the price point, for the sensor size, for everything about the GH cameras. Getting to 6K makes sense at this point in time compared to Canon doing 8K, compared to Sony doing 4K but higher frame rates. And that's something that should be on the GH6 as well, more frame rates. And this is kind of the obvious evolution of any camera. The resolution should probably increase reasonably. I don't think doing 8K and then having a camera that overheats is a good idea, but I've made another video kind of criticizing Canon for that. The GH6 can do 6K. It's a reasonable upgrade. Focus on the video features. I think that's what makes the GH camera so special, is their kind of commitment to video and how early they embraced true proper video features in a hybrid mirrorless camera. I talk about this all the time, but shutter angle, the fact that you can set shutter angle on a GH5 and the GH4 before it, and I don't remember when they first implemented that, but just that you can do it and makes shooting video, it's a firmware feature, right? It's just in the software. It's just a little switch or a little thing they can program. It doesn't require anything special hardware-wise on the camera. It's just a way to set the shutter, but being able to dial in shutter angle rather than just shutter speed, which is a photography thing. Let's do shutter angle, which is a more video film thing. Let's use that, and that should be widely embraced on all these cameras at this point in time because they're pushing video, and the GH cameras have been doing that a lot longer, intentionally putting that out there. The Lumix brand is, hey, we are champions of video in a hybrid form. Takes good photos, shoots great video. You want to do both, and that's why it's so popular for so many people. The sensor size, let's talk about that. I think it would be wise for them to consider adding a slightly bigger than micro four thirds sensor. I know this is crazy to anyone who's a micro four thirds fanatic. You can keep the mount the same, keep it micro four thirds, but do a super 35 sensor in the GH6. This is actually, if you don't know the camera, there's the JVC LS300. It has exactly that. It's a micro four third mount with a super 35 millimeter sensor. It's it's like the only camera I can think of that's done this, and I understand why it's not popular, because I don't think a lot of people understand the benefits of it. Keep the GH6 micro four third mount. So if you put a micro four third lens on there, it crops the sensor. Like you'll get, that micro four third look with your micro four third glass, and nothing changes. This is just like if you put an APS-C lens on a full frame camera from Canon or Sony, they know to crop because of the lens, and you can change that and you can say like, don't crop it, I don't want it to crop, but like it's intelligent enough to know that the lens is meant for a smaller sensor, so it crops the image, and that's how it's meant to work. And I think people love this feature on full frame cameras. It would be great to have in a micro four third body, because then imagine being able to put full frame or super 35 APS-C lenses on your GH6 and having with an adapter, right? Because so many people are adapting glass to micro four third. Half of my bag is adapters from Canon to Nikon. There's so many different ways to put different lenses on micro four third mount, just because you can basically put anything on there that you want. Makes it kind of universal for all this glass that's out there, old vintage stuff, newer stuff that's meant for DSLR cameras with like a mirror box. I mean, now that Canon is moving away from EF and they're going to RF, you're going to have a lot of EF lenses out there that are great lenses, are fantastic, and they can be used on the RF system. But I imagine they're going to be a little bit cheaper, a little bit come down in value, where people are moving to the RF system. All that glass is still valuable. Imagine being able to put that on a GH6 with an adapter, and you have a super 35 sensor in there. You could use a speed booster on the micro four third mount, but it's a super 35 sensor, and now you can actually get a full frame equivalent with a speed booster working that trick, which also works on the JVC LS300. If you don't know about that camera, look it up, because it's really interesting, kind of quirky what they did, but I think it'd be smart to do something similar as kind of like a neat benefit for the people who understand. The people that don't, or they don't really get the reasoning of why you would want to do that, it's still, the GH6 should still do all the same things, like resolution for photography and everything would be the same for Micro Four Third, but it has this kind of cool, maybe it's like more of like a hidden feature or a nice little benefit. If you think back to the GH2, it had a multi-aspect sensor. So basically, it was a larger Micro Four Third sensor, and at no point in time were you actually seeing the full sensor. It would just crop differently depending on what you were shooting. But because it was multi-aspect, it was a little bit oversized, you were able to do things like have kind of this wider field of view on a Micro Four Third camera, and you're not degrading when you're cropping from 16:9, 4:3, 3:2, or all the different variations there, different aspect ratios. You're not hurt as much compared to if you have like a 4:3 sensor and then you shoot 4:3, and great, you get everything there, but when you move to 3:2 or 16:9, now you're cropping in on that. So having a slightly large sensor gives you a lot of benefits in a lot of ways that aren't immediately obvious. It doesn't, strike you at the front of the page of like, oh, this is why you need this feature, but it would be really smart and really helpful for people like myself, and I imagine a lot of other shooters out there who like Micro Four Third because it was one of the first mirrorless systems that made sense and had, invested in video with the GH cameras. I've got a lot of Micro Four Third lenses, but I also have a lot of other lenses, cinema lenses, old school photography lenses for TSLRs that I love to mix and match depending on the project, and just having that functionality is great. Of course, the GH6, they have to keep anamorphic, and even more anamorphic features are great. I love that the GH cameras have embraced this as well. It's a very video film-centric thing to be able to shoot anamorphic. Keep doing it. Don't stop. Like, nothing should be taken away because everything about the GH5 is awesome. Just make it better. Another thing I've talked about before that I think would be valuable on a GH6 is some kind of internal ND mechanism. Now, is this a filter wheel where you like scroll and you have filters that slot in place? If there's room, great, do that. If there's not room, or there's a better way to do it with like an electronic ND that has kind of been in, I believe it's like the FS5 or it's the Sony FS5 or a version thereof. There's an electronic ND. And the reason this is so important, a lot of people may not understand the benefit of like, well, why I can just use an external ND filter. It's really, really valuable to not have to put a filter on a lens, and then when you want to change lenses, having to change the filter with it. Lenses come in all shapes and sizes, and those filters don't always work. If you have a cinema lens, well, now you have to go to a matte box system, and your filters may not match up, or you have to have multiple filters to do the same thing. It's so much easier when it's built right into the camera, like it is on broadcast cameras. And again, this is a very video-centric feature that a lot of people who shoot video need because you're outdoors and your shutter speed is kind of locked. So to explain why this is so valuable, okay, when you're shooting video, your shutter angle 180 degrees, like pretty much all the time. It's not always, but for the most part, 180 degree shutter angle. You're probably going to be shooting f2.8, f4 if you're on a Micro Four Third sensor, because you want that shallow depth of field. Probably you want the blurry background. So your aperture is going to be, you're going to be using a fast aperture because you want that shallow depth of field. And your ISO, yes, it can go up when you have low light situations and you need to amplify the light. You need to make those photo sites and those pixels more sensitive so you can amplify the light that you're collecting. But there really isn't a good internal mechanism for when you have too much light, given the fact that your shutter angle is kind of set and your aperture is kind of set. You probably want to be shooting with the lowest ISO possible, or at least native, so that you have low noise in your image. But how do you go below that? There isn't a good mechanism in cameras, in these mirrorless cameras, and that's why you need ND filters. It's annoying to have to put them on the front of a lens and then switch them when you're changing lenses. Build it into the camera. This would be kind of radical in the mirrorless, small, hybrid, compact market. This is a very big camera feature, and if there's room for it, if they can figure out a way to cram it into a GH6, I think it would be one of the most valuable features they could add. It would probably sell the camera alone, on that alone, just for the video people who want that functionality and that ease of use, that I can go anywhere and shoot anything because I can control my aperture, which I'm mostly locked in. I can control my shutter, which I'm mostly locked in. I want a low ISO because I want low noise. So really I can use the ND to actually control my exposure, and I'm not risking using, cheap third-party ND filters, or losing a filter, or getting scratched, or switching lenses, and it being this huge hassle. And it's not really just even a video feature either. Think of all the times you're doing photography and it's daylight. Well, I guess it depends on the type of photographer you are, but like there are many situations where you want a slower shutter speed when you're doing photography to get more motion blur. Think, landscape, waterfalls during the daytime. How do you get those beautiful water streaks from, with all that motion blur? It's using ND filters while you're taking a photo. This isn't super common. A lot of people may not think of photography in this way, but ND filters are just as valuable for certain types of imaging when you're taking photos. And so while at the forefront it looks like a video feature, it has this great photography benefit as well, truly making that hybrid camera make sense. This would be huge, and I think they should absolutely try and do something like this on a GH6. And then when you look at that and you say, okay, it's 6K, it's got good frame rates, internal stabilization, keep that, keep the flip screen, like keep most of what the GH5 is, and then add these few other really helpful features that no one else is really doing. At least the functionality, like the Super 35 sensor, like that's weird and kind of quirky, but it makes sense. Same thing with the built-in NDs. People say, oh, you don't really need that. But like once you have it, you don't want to lose it. Keep things like shutter angle, keep things like anamorphic, like everything about the camera. Just when you put that all together in one package and you say, well, yeah, it's not 8K, but it doesn't overheat. And yeah, it's not full frame like the Sony, but it has built-in NDs. And you look at it and you go, okay, well, these other cameras are around kind of like $3,000, $4,000 for the full frame one. Now you're looking at a $2,000, maybe sub $2,000 camera with the GH6. That's incredibly attractive, and I think they would sell a lot of cameras by doing just that. If there's other features that I'm not even thinking about, of course, like add those too, right? I can only have so many ideas, but from my personal experience, GH5 is great. These are the few extra features that would really put it over the top and get it to, be a clear winner in the marketplace. And I think you wouldn't have as much of when you talk about Lumix cameras to people who shoot Sony, and if it's the Micro Four Thirds ones, because now Lumix has full frame, so you have to make that distinction with the S1, the S1H and the S1R and the S1 are full frame Lumix cameras. But in general, Lumix has been known, Micro Four Third brand, primarily with the GH cameras at least, for quite some time, as being a smaller sensor, having to deal with a crop factor. And you get into the whole conversation of lenses and focal lengths and, well, what's the crop? What's the crop? It's not full frame. What's the crop? If you shoot Micro Four Third, you can work around all these things, and it's not actually that big of a deal. But people who come from that full frame mindset just think, oh, well, like it's not full frame, so it must be bad. I'll pay more for this other one. But then the people who get a GH5 or a GH4 or maybe a GH6 in the future understand like how powerful these cameras are and the amount that you can do. And even though it's not full frame, you still get all of these benefits, and you can basically, you can do anything that a Sony camera can do as well, aside from the autofocus. That's the one thing. The autofocus, not as good, but I mean, once they fix that technology, like that'll be there too. So I don't want to say it's the perfect camera, right? If you need autofocus, maybe the GH6, they can do it. Maybe they can implement some new tracking so you can actually get like razor sharp images just focused on eye tracking. Like that would be the best, right? Hopefully they can do it. But if that's a feature that's like kind of a deal breaker. Do you need that absolute like autofocus tracking in any situation? Then go for a Sony. You probably, if that's what you want, then obviously get the Sony. But if you want to be more video focused, which a lot of times I'm not shooting autofocus anyway, I'm doing manual focus, so in that case it doesn't really help me. These features would be my personal. That's what I would want in my bag. That's what I would want to pull out. That's the camera I would love to shoot with each and every day. And given the price point of it, it should be cheaper. It's Micro Four Third. It should be cheaper than a full frame camera. So like that to me is the perfect package of what, and if and when the GH6 comes, I think they'd sell a lot of cameras doing something like that.